Howdy everybody. So today we're going to be talking about note-taking. So we're going to be looking at some note-taking tips, some studying tips, kind of some of the stuff I've learned, as well as some other stuff that's just out in the world that might be useful for you. Now the fundamental thing we're talking about note-taking and studying is you got to have a little bit of trial and error. You have to figure out what works for you. I can tell you what works for me, but you're going to have to figure it out if it works for you, tweak it, maybe try something different. I'm going to give you all a lot of different options. So this is stuff to try. It's not like you have to do it this way, but try it out, see what works for you, and play with it, modify it, tweak it until it works for you perfectly. So one of the best things I can recommend is to handwrite, then type your notes. So when you're first taking notes, I know a lot of people like typing it because it's more efficient, it's quicker for many people. But if you handwrite it, there's some sort of a neurological pathway that whenever you're physically writing something down, it builds some sort of connection in your brain. And there's other things like, if you have a certain drink or a smell that goes along with it, then you smell that smell again, it'll remind you of what it is. We're not going to get that in depth in all this, but writing for sure builds a more solid pathway. It solidifies that memory in your brain far more clearly than typing. Now, I think typing is excellent and it's useful and you should totally do it. But handwrite your notes first. It takes a little bit longer, it's a little more tedious, but it's better. It builds those memories more solidly. Then, after you've done a chapter or done a lecture set of notes, go ahead and type up your notes. So as you're typing them, pull out key points, kind of rearrange things that make more sense. Because when you're handwriting, you can kind of write stuff in the margins if you forgot something, or if it's a lecture and I mentioned something later that you think relates to an earlier thing, you can kind of write it in the margins and all this kind of stuff. You can reorder it when you type it, and then you can kind of condense it, really focus it on what you need to focus on for the class, and maybe cut out some of the extraneous information that you weren't sure if you needed, in the middle of a lecture. You're like, that sounds kind of important, but I'm not sure. I better just write it down just in case. Well, maybe when you're editing your notes and revising them, you're like, oh, well, that's clearly not a crucial point. Or he said later that, that's not extremely necessary for the test, or whatever it might be. That'll give you the opportunity to condense it and work through it a little more kind of succinctly so that when you are studying, it'll be a much quicker, more efficient process. Now, style of notes. So we'll talk about 4 different styles of notes, and I'll should have little pop-ups here in a second to kind of show examples as I'm talking about them. And these will also be on our little note-taking study tip sheet with examples as well. So I'll kind of briefly talk about each of them. So the first is a simple outline. So if you look at the note-taking study tip sheet, that is a simple outline. Now you have your title, whatever your title of the lecture or the chapter is. Then you have your first point, and then the subpoint, and then subpoints under that. So you just kind of create a hierarchy, and then whenever you're ready to start a new topic, you just bump it back up and do whatever you need to do. So this is probably the most simple version of note-taking. It's straightforward, it's easy, it's fairly logical for most people when they think about it. It's what I use going through, my whole academic career. I still use it. I use it for my to-do lists. I use it for the note-taking tips sheet that y'all just saw. So all this kinds of stuff comes together, and it is a very helpful tool. Like, it's probably the simplest, but it's one of the best. So try it out, see if you like it. One of the most popular is the Cornell note-taking method. Now, this is taught in a lot of high schools, a lot of elementary schools. This is one of the most popular ones, and it uses kind of a margin where you kind of have key terms, key ideas, and then you have notes in the right-hand side that are a little more in-depth, a little more detailed than what you would have on the left-hand margin. This is similar to outlining, but it's just a kind of a more chart-like format. So you kind of have a point, and then you elaborate on that point, then a point, and elaborate. And it kind of, some people like the differentiation, the division. That seems to help some people really focus and break things down. Up to you. Now, one of the more creative versions of note-taking is something called bullet journaling. So some people do this as like an everyday journal or a task-based journal, but often it's very creative. If you ever go on Reddit and look at the bullet journaling subreddit, there are beautifully done bullet journals. You can spend hours and hours drawing. Now, I don't necessarily recommend going quite that hardcore for your lecture or class notes, but if visual stuff does help you recall things, maybe try bullet journaling. So you can look up all the different styles. There's no one correct way to bullet journal. It's kind of whatever style suits you. There's a whole bunch of theories and preferred methods of bullet journaling. So you can look that up and figure out one you like. But highly recommend. So say you're writing about a battle, maybe sketch out a little drawing of two soldiers fighting or whatever the issue is. Or if we're talking about like Mexican history, maybe draw, the eagle with the snake for the Mexican flag or something to kind of tie it to you, and then the process of drawing is going to help. Or maybe you're not that great at drawing, so you're better at decorating. So, get some washi tape, get some, just decorative color markers and pencils and write things in different colors. So all this kind of stuff can help you do it. And bullet journaling is kind of formalization, kind of gives you a framework in which to do that. Then you have the charting method. So this could be a basic chart, kind of similar to Cornell, but a little more grid in its formatting. Now this kind of also ties into timelines, other graphic aids, etc. that can be helpful. So if you have timelines in your class, or if you're in a history class like ours, build a timeline. So this can work well with bullet journaling. You have your normal bullet journal, then down the column you have your timeline going up and down. And each page is a new section of that timeline as you go through time. So all of these can be useful tools. Sometimes you can combine them and they'll be useful tools. Like maybe toss a chart or a timeline into your simple outline. So there's no one way to do this. There's no one right way. And you don't have to stick to, you say, I'm going to try Cornell. I'm not going to try anything else. I'm going to make this work. Well, you can do that, and it'll probably work okay, but maybe you want to borrow some of the drawing ideas from bullet journaling, or some of the charting ideas, or maybe you want to outline a section of your Cornell. So there's no one inherent way to do this, so try it out, see which one works for you. Now, textbooks. Pretty much every college course you're going to take has a textbook of some format. It might be online, might be digital, might be physical one, whatever it might be. But textbooks follow a general pattern. So look at your titles of your chapters, look at headings, the subheadings, all these kinds of things. Look at those, and that'll, if you're doing an outline or Cornell method, that'll give you the big bulk ideas. And that'll kind of give you your main points, and then underneath that you can build out the rest of your outline or notes or whatever you're going to do. Key terms, that's another thing. So like with Cornell, you have that left-hand column for key terms. So pop a key term in there and write about it. So all this kind of stuff helps. End of chapter headings and questions, End of chapter questions. Make sure you read those. I know it's sometimes tedious. Very few professors actually use them in the actual course, but they are helpful, because you don't necessarily have to write out answers, but if you can kind of read it and say, okay, this is the answer. I have learned the answer from reading this chapter. Now don't fool yourself, say, oh, I would have known that if I had seen that on a test. Be honest with yourself. Be like, I know this makes sense, I clearly read that 5-10 minutes ago, I know that point. If you're like, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'll remember it in the future, don't bet on that. Make a note of it. If you don't know the answer, maybe write that section a little more in depth so it jogs your memory and kind of ingrains it a little bit better. Don't trust that you'll know it in the future, because our memories are extremely fallible. We think, oh, I'll remember that, I'll do that. I don't trust myself to remember anything. I use notes on my phone. I have, to-do list that I carry around with me, like a paper one that I have all my weekly tasks on. I keep everything written down, so I don't have to remember everything, and it kind of takes that pressure off my mind. If it's there, I have it prepared, then I don't have to do the actual activity of thinking about it, because it's already there. It's kind of automating one of the processes of my life. So do the same with note taking. let your notes do the heavy lifting so you don't have to. Now, studying. Once you get your notes written, how do you study? Well, just like with note taking, handwrite and then type your notes. That's kind of the first step that I always used for studying. Because when I did my initial note taking, I hand wrote all my notes. So in lectures I did it, in textbooks, when I did do notes from textbooks, I did that. And then like your first step of studying is actually the transcribing of that material, because you're reviewing it all in depth. You're kind of going word for word, line by line, saying, okay, I like this part, I'm going to put it here. That's not really necessary, I'm scratching that out. So, and you can kind of consolidate and do this process, and just simply by transcribing it and typing it up, you are learning the material more in depth. Second, this is a professor at A&M taught me this, and I've used it ever since he taught it to me. My first semester at A&M, kind of rocky. Took his class second semester. He had a note study tips class, kind of like this. He had an evening class that he did just for people who wanted to learn about this. And he said, this is the trick. And he said a periodic review of your material. So, say before class, if you're in face-to-face, or if you're online, whatever day or time you set aside for reading or studying, whenever you're there, so say you're sitting before class, before your reading time, you have your spiral notebook or whatever you use to write your notes, while you're kind of getting ready and preparing your mind to sit down and do your work, flip through. So whatever the previous test material, so whatever the test block is for this time, go to the beginning of that section and kind of just flip through. Don't sit down and try to read the whole thing and go through all your notes in depth. Instead, try to review and just kind of say, oh, that's a key term. Oh, that's an important point. Oh, I remember that idea. I remember writing that. And then just kind of flip through. It shouldn't take more than 5, maybe 10 minutes tops if you have a long test block. So maybe by week 5 of that test block, maybe it'll take a little bit longer. But for the first half, just kind of skim through. And what this is going to do is keep your mind fresh. It's going to remind you of what you wrote. Kind of be like, oh, I remember when George Washington did that, or I remember what happened in that war, or I remember that, economic crisis we talked about in history, or whatever it is. Just something so it keeps those pathways fresh. Because if you never see anything, say, about Jamestown, and the test covers from Jamestown to the Constitution, and you don't look at Jamestown again until you're ready to take your test, Jamestown's going to be pretty old and rusty. So if you just constantly oh, there's Jamestown, oh, there was this conflict with Indians, oh, they were starving, oh, they had to eat people, all these kinds of things, and it's just going to keep jogging your memory. So every day, every 2 days, every 3 days, whenever you sit down to do it, just recap. Now, if your final exam is a comprehensive exam, maybe set 1 day a week aside to do older material. So if you're on test 2 or 3 and the final's coming up, start going back each week to the very beginning. So pick 1 day, and it might take 20 or 30 minutes, and just kind of review everything, kind of just jog your memory, look at key terms, look at people's names, places, all this kinds of stuff. And this will keep it all fresh, so that when you are sitting down to do a real study session, you're not feeling so overwhelmed. You're not, drowning in all this material. You're like, oh, I know this. This is something I've looked at. This is something I've seen weekly. It's not forgotten. It might be rusty. It might not be, right at the forefront of your mind, but it's there. So, third, use class resources. Professors and colleges and universities often require that a syllabus is written for the class, so that'll tell you everything that needs to be done. But often in a syllabus, you have things like learning goals or learning outcomes. There should be a schedule with topics, so you know what that week is supposed to cover or what that lecture is supposed to cover. So make sure you look at those. Use those as your kind of main goals for that note-taking session. So okay, we're talking about the Gilded Age this week, so I should have a very clear understanding of what the Gilded Age is. So use those learning goals and outcomes. If it says by the end of this, chapter, you should be able to know this, this, and this. Make sure you can know those 3 things. Because if it's in the outline or in the learning goals or outcomes, the professor's probably going to test on those things because there's probably some review process that's beyond his or her control that he has to prove that he has taught those things to his students. So, do that. Utilize those kind of built-in frameworks for your notes. Then, if a professor does test reviews or study sheets or anything like that, I know for my classes, I have those ready pretty much, week 1 or 2 of the class for the whole semester. So you get all of your stuff day 1, day 5, whatever day it is that I get it out. But look at those test reviews, use those study sheets, all that kind of stuff. But some professors may give them out a week before the test. Well, kind of maybe type your notes and reorganize them right then with the study sheet so you know what to focus on. So utilize the tools the professor gives you because he or she wants you to do well in the course, and by utilizing these tools, you can just better prepare yourself. Textbooks. So, like we were talking about with writing notes, headings. So your headings, your titles. One kind of trick I learned was turn them into questions. So whatever the heading or title or subheading is, say, it's, George Washington's presidency. Try to find a way to turn that into a question. Maybe it's, what were the key events in George Washington's presidency? Or how did George Washington's presidency change U.S. history? So try to reword it into a question. Then your notes, when you're reading through your notes that you've written under that subheading, you should be able to answer whatever theoretical question you create. Use keywords. So most textbooks use bolded keywords. Focus on that. That's going to at least point you in the right direction. It may not be a perfect, goal or signpost for what the professor is going to test on, but it will be a step in the right direction. And then, like I said earlier, those end of chapter questions. If you can answer those, you're on the right track. It's not going to be a one-to-one equation for what the test is going to cover, but the professor will most likely write something in the ballpark of that. So it might not be ideal, might not be perfect, but it will be close. So these are some of the tips I had. These are some of the things that worked well for me going to school, along with some other things that I've run across over my time, being a student and teaching and all these kinds of things. So take a look at them, look at the note sheet, look at the examples, and see what works for you. Try it out. If you have questions, just let me know. I'm always happy to answer or talk about this. But I'll stop there for today, and I will see y'all next time.